Good evening, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you to the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Garden tonight for what I think will be a really enlightening presentation. I'm Nicole Cavender. I'm the director of the Botanical Gardens here at the Huntington, and I'd like to just say a few words about tonight's featured speaker, Stephen Blackmore. I know him best through his work with BGCI, which is the Botanic Gardens Conservation International, where he serves as chairman. BGCI is the world's largest network for plant conservation with 60,000 horticulturists, scientists, and educators from over 700 member institutions in over 100 countries. BGCI's critical role is to mobilize botanical skills, expertise, and data for the conservation of all plant diversity and livelihood benefits of people. And under Steve's tenure, the membership of BGCI has more than doubled from 350 to over 750 botanic gardens around the world. And our global tree assessment work is the largest red listing project ever undertaken, with all 60,000 tree species of the world assessed by the end of this year. The BGCI US office is hosted right here at the Huntington, at the Botanical Center. And Abby Herdmeyer is here tonight, and she is the executive director. Also with BGCI, Ari Novi, who is the chair of the US Botanic Garden Conservation International and also the director of the San Diego Botanic Garden. He's here, and two other board members, Mary Blodgett and Bob Pedersen, are here tonight. So thanks for being here to share this great evening with Steve Blackmore. Now, Steve not only chairs BGCI, but he is the King's Botanist. More properly, His Majesty's Botanist in Scotland. And from 1999 to 2013, he was the Regis Keeper of the Royal Botanic Garden at Edinburgh. He has been inspired by nature since his school days in Hong Kong and has traveled globally collecting and studying plants. After graduating with his PhD in botany from the University of Reading, he lived and worked in Malawi before joining the Natural History Museum in London. Now, he and I both share this. He believes the world's botanical gardens will play a critical role in securing a better future for plants, people, and the planet by helping tackle some of the greatest environmental challenges of our time. Stephen, we are honored and thrilled to have you here tonight and to learn more about gardening the earth, plants, and people for the future.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Nicole, for that kind introduction. And it's wonderful to be here with you this evening in this beautiful place. And I'm going to be sharing a number of observations I've made in my life with you, but I'm going to start with a simple one about this place, because I have had the pleasure of traveling very widely around the world, and I have to say that the Chinese garden here is undoubtedly the best one outside China, where real things like the garden in Suzhou, those World Heritage Sites are, that I've seen them. And I have seen many imitations, and I've seen one real one outside China. That, for me, is a hallmark of quality. But this place has an incredibly diverse collection of plants. It has beautiful themed gardens, and I was really struck thinking about coming this time, my third visit, I've had two short visits before, by the fact that there's a Shakespeare garden. And that really resonated with me for a reason I'll show you in a moment. But I loved the text on the website about it, which talked about the literary treasures in the collection being here surrounded by nature in a beautiful way. And I have to say that I think that's a superb description of this institute, and there is no better place for such collections to be. That relationship is a wonderful one. Now, here's why I quite liked it when I saw it, because I'm very fond of Shakespeare too. But I take certain liberties, so I'm not sure you're allowed to edit him. But also, one of my favorite well-known speeches from As You Like It, all the world's a garden is what he meant. And I'm going to be coming back to unpicking why I like this so much. But what I want you to understand is that from my viewpoint, and this is what I want to persuade you tonight, it's a very good way of thinking about planet Earth as a garden. And one of the reasons for that is because nature on planet Earth has been so much changed and modified and altered by humans, by accident, by design, but throughout our history. So it's really very, very different because of what we have done in our interactions with nature. And actually that's really the same sort of thing as what a garden is, a place where people have altered and changed and shaped and influenced. So we may be accidentally gardening the planet, but we are nevertheless gardening it. And I want to try and draw that out and illustrate what I mean by it. But also I like this because Shakespeare was absolutely right too, that one person, let's say, in their time can play many different roles. And my talk is going to be about our human relationship with nature. And what I hope you'll all think about is how might we interact with nature? What are our roles in relation to nature? So this is what I'm going to try and cover. And I want you to, as it were, to think of all the world as a garden. Because it is, in my way of thinking about things. It's not a natural planet. It's a planet shaped by us, even the wildest and most remote places. So it's the way it is on Earth because of what our interaction has been. So that we should recognize then, I think, that we in fact are the gardeners. And I like that way of thinking about the world because look what gardeners do outside here. It can be beautiful and it can be in the world. So I'm going to show how, as Nicole has mentioned, botanic gardens are addressing some of the really great challenges of our time, ranging from how do we tackle climate change, how do we care for biodiversity, how do we deal with poverty in so many countries around the world. And my real interest in life at the moment is what can be achieved when botanic gardens work together, and if we were able to accelerate what we're doing together with partners, many of them who are not botanic gardens, but in wider aspects of life, just what we might achieve in giving a better future. And so those are going to be the things I'll touch on. I'm going to use examples from places I've lived and worked in, some of which you've already heard a little bit about. But first I'm going to take us back to school, because I always think that's a good place to go. And I wanted to go back to school to remind us about photosynthesis. This is this incredible process by means of which plants can use energy coming from the sun and convert two common resources, carbon dioxide and water, and make carbohydrate or sugars and oxygen out of those simple ingredients. Now, that is basically what powers and supports all life on Earth. And it's a process that started over 2.5 billion years ago in a group of organisms called blue-green algae. These are modern-day ones, so the early life on Earth ones didn't really look like this, but they're in the same group. These were the first plants which had this ability to capture sunlight and to use it to drive that process. And so by about 2 billion years ago, because of photosynthesis, they had produced so much oxygen into the oceans and finally into the atmosphere that it became possible for life to emerge onto land, and also for life to be life which used oxygen more and more. And if this process hadn't happened, there would have been no life on land, and there would have been no possibility of humans existing. The atmosphere 2.5 billion years ago was mainly carbon dioxide and nitrogen, and basically we couldn't breathe that, we would have died. So plants created the conditions for human life and all life on planet Earth. And we have a scientific name for that. It's called ecosystem services. And I tend to think that's a very mundane way of referring to a set of kind of everyday miracles that sustain all life on Earth. It's rather functional and prosaic. But nevertheless, it's absolutely true. Without plant life, we would not have existed in the first place. We would not have had the ability to develop in the way that we have. But a key point I'd like to make in our talk tonight is that actually now we need plants as we always have, but now plants actually need us. And without human intervention, far too many are simply going to slide into extinction. So we must get involved in nature. I might come back to that quite a bit later on. This was a rather nice diagram from a paper about forests in Germany, but what I like is it summarizes some of the benefits, these ecosystem services we get. That's rather a lot of them. But basically, we wouldn't be here without them. So I like to say that we don't celebrate enough the sort of beauty and the importance of plants in human life. And this was a nice exception, an exhibit I saw at Chelsea Flower Show some years ago of vegetables, which really says, wow, look at this. And I love it as an example of that is the basis of our existence and our life on Earth. It's a really good, colourful reminder that all of our food comes from plants or from animals that have eaten plants. But also we know that plants play this incredibly critical role in the water cycle of our planet, putting moisture into the air, slowing down the runoff of rain off the land. Plants are doing so much in the background there, and we often forget that. And the way I like to summarize it is to say that if you, or anyone you know, likes to eat or drink or breathe, don't forget to give thanks to plants. These are things we would not be doing otherwise. But as we all know, there are problems with our planet. This is a photograph I took 40 years ago on a plant collecting trip I did in Honduras, where I had the pleasure of visiting that beautiful country and going through this forest, through this road that was being carved through a wonderful, rich, incredibly diverse forest. I've not been back to that particular place, but I looked recently on Google Earth to see what it looks like now, and there are some tiny patches of forest still left on the tops of the trees. But in a story repeated around the world, as soon as the road goes in, the forest is lost. And who knows what was lost with this forest. And today we're still losing 4 million hectares every year of primary old-growth forests like this that they are just priceless. They are the ones that really provide these ecosystem services. So one of the things I'd like you to think about too is that when we think about climate change, we rightly focus on greenhouse gas emissions and the carbon dioxide that's being put into the atmosphere. But we very often forget that the absorption and use of carbon and carbon dioxide is work, as it were, done by plants, and their capacity to do that has been greatly reduced for thousands of years by human activities. So this is probably the only sort of technical chart I'm going to show you. It comes from a paper that Earl Ellis published some years ago, and it concerns this human transformation of the biosphere. And I've superimposed onto it a white line which is roughly tracking human population through the same period of time. And the first thing to notice is that even if you went back to 6000 BC, which was not the start of humanity, it's the start of this graph, wildlands had already been reduced quite significantly, and this was semi-natural. There's the beginnings of agriculture coming in here. But really it is only since the time of the Industrial Revolution that human numbers and population began to explode and to take off in the way that they have done. So, I'm speaking to you tonight. I was born on a planet of 2.5 billion people, And it is more than doubled to 8 billion of us today. And it's no surprise that that puts an enormous stress and demand on the natural resource base of our planet. But look at the expansion of urban areas and rangelands and croplands versus nature. So nature has been pushed into retreat by that expansion in humanity. And as a botanist for more than 50 years now, I have been in what I've often felt is the front line of that attack on nature, that kind of situation in Honduras. I've seen that in so many places where there was a forest or there was a whatever and it's gone. But the point I want to talk about tonight is not that, because the thing that I've seen, which is even more important, is that we can actually repair that damage. And I'm going to show you some projects which are setting out to reverse that type of damage. It's not easy, but we can do it. And it can only be done, actually, with botanic gardens. So biodiversity, when we think about it, there's really 3 conceptual levels to it. And I just want us to remember that all 3 of these are impacted as we lose biodiversity. There's ecosystems, that in huge global diversity of landscapes, each particular to a particular context of geography and of climate, but that diversity. The species level is often where we really begin to engage. And for plants, we don't yet know how many there are, because at least 2,000 new ones are discovered each year still. So we think that the best estimate is probably about 400,000 species. And of course, many are being lost before they're even described. But really interestingly, and not thought about enough, is the genetic level, which I want to focus on for a moment. Because at the genetic level, everybody in this room is distinct and diverse, unless we have any identical twins. And they're not all different, but it's the same with plants, except that in plants you can also get things that are clonal. Now that genetic diversity in us and in plants is hugely important, because it is the difference in the ability to adapt to different circumstances in the world. And in a fast-changing planet, it's the difference to adapt to future challenges. So it is a key to future resilience that we must do what we can, not just to maintain the species or the ecosystems, but to think about that level of genetic diversity. There's too often things done where a single variety, or cultivated variety, is planted. Surprise, surprise, they suddenly all die from a particular pest that goes through. Not one individual was resistant. That doesn't happen so much in nature where there is diversity. So we have to think about that diversity. Now, I'm grateful to Nicole for having touched on the State of the World's Trees that was published in 2021, but I wanted to show it just to drill down a little into what's really going on, focusing at the species level. So that report showed that we now know the number of trees in the world, which will go up slowly because we're still discovering them, of course, but 142 species are already extinct, lost, gone forever. They won't be seen again. There are about 30% of all trees on our planet Earth are threatened with this extinction at the moment. And in a sense, if you were looking for good news, well, there is some, because there's 41% of trees currently not threatened. But it's a huge proportion of plant diversity that is currently threatened with extinction. And I'm going to show you the kind of things that we can work on to do something about that. Because if trees are in trouble, we are in trouble. So I'm going to put it in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. This is the world's agenda for sorting out these huge problems. And there's 17 of them, from poverty to education, gender equality, a whole set of things. And right there, number 15 concerns life on land. That's the one that focuses in on biodiversity. And I want to show you that botanic gardens contribute to so many of these goals. I'm not saying they solve them or do them all and that nobody else does, but we can make contribution to so many of them. And you'll spot during my talk that I've clipped out some of these little logos and put them in just to remind some of the things that projects are doing. It's rather a lot. So what are botanic gardens doing then? Well, This is one that I visited a few years ago in Geneva, and it is, like many botanic gardens, like this one, a beautiful place to go to. It's uplifting to the spirits to be in these sorts of beautiful, safe, wonderful environments. But botanic gardens are all of that and very, very much more. Because what they hold in their people and in their plants is the key to tackling many of these major challenges that we're facing in the world. And that potential of botanic gardens, which is the thing that really excites me these days, comes from their people and their plants. And I'm going to show you a bit about those people and plants. And they are not ordinary people, and they are not ordinary plants. So here's one. This is my favorite example of a botanic garden plant, and I've used it in many talks I've given around the world. And it is a small tree found in Mexico, extinct in the wild, Depia splendens, and I've only ever seen it once. That was here in the Huntington in 2016 when I was visiting, and Dylan Hannon took me on a tour and showed me this beautiful tree, which, as I say, has been lost except in those botanic gardens that are growing it now. And one would like to hope one day it might get put back into the wild, but at present there is nowhere in its correct habitat that it could live and thrive. So it's a botanic garden specimen. It's precisely documented. We know where we got it from. We know exactly when and where it comes from. And botanic gardens, between them, collectively, around the world, we now know, because BGCI has compiled the information, grow about 105,000 species of plants, which is about a third of all plants, 30%, let's say. When we worked that out, we were quite pleased with ourselves, but what it showed us is, what about the other 70%? We have got to increase the diversity that's in our collections and also what we do with them. Good news there was that actually 41% of all the world's threatened plants are grown in at least one botanic garden. So we have a start then. But for many of these plants, they're alive only in the garden. And I'm going to talk about botanic garden people now. And these are some of my former colleagues at Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. And botanic gardens have experts in so many different fields, but I'm only going to talk about the horticulturalists tonight because they are a hugely important, rare resource in the world. They are the only people that can grow many kinds of plants. And the good ones, like my dear friend David Knott, can go into the field in a very remote bit of China, get seeds, bring them back and bring those into the collection. And they can pass through horticultural quarantine facilities to know that the plants we're bringing in are healthy and safe and not going to be problems. And then we can grow them and produce them. And we can produce them in sufficient numbers even to begin putting them back into nature. Now, this is one of my favorite botanic garden nurseries at a botanic garden I know well in Hong Kong, where, as Nicole mentioned, I spent some of my childhood years at school. This is Kaduri Farm and Botanic Garden, and this is their nursery. And again, they can do everything from collecting seeds. This is an oak, Cyclobalanopsis, that grows in Hong Kong. And they can grow them up in their thousands. And these superheroes of horticulture can grow those plants, produce them. The lady with the wheelbarrow is taking back some of dozens, hundreds of plants that have been restored into the wild, and I'll show you that project in a minute. So this nursery is a factory for restoring the planet. And I also want to mention just how enormous our reach is globally, our audience, if you like, because we know that 750 million people are the visitors to botanic gardens every year around the world. So we have the ability to make a huge impact through our educational programs and through everything else we do, coming into contact with people and informing them about botanic gardens. And again, some of my former colleagues in Edinburgh. And what botanic gardens do, when they work together, can really go way beyond the education program or the research program of any individual garden. Now, again, thanks to Nicole, you've already mentioned some of this. This is where BGCI comes in. It's a wonderful network, and this is from an annual report, a slightly out-of-date one a couple of years ago. But as you've heard, that's its mission. This is the largest network of people focused on plant conservation. And it has this growing number of member gardens out of about 3,000 gardens in the world. those are the ones that pay to join. They are supporters. But actually, the work we do benefits all gardens, whether they can pay or not. It's just a resource that's put out there. Not that we could do that without those members. And we have a number of regional offices, which is increasing. So this is now out of date. But the headquarters is at BGCI Global in London. There's an office in Guangzhou in China and in Singapore and BGCI in Africa. And coming soon, another one in the Caribbean, another one in South America. But look at that. Where's this place? I think I've heard of it. But the point is, as Nicole mentioned, BGCI US is here. And you've already introduced these three superstars, Nicole, including yourself. Ari, who's in the audience here, is president of San Diego Botanic Garden, chairs the board there. Nicole herself is very much involved, and by the way, is our newest trustee on the board of the global board of BGCI. Just joined us and will be at her first meeting in May. We're very happy to have you, Nicole. And Abby, who I've met here so many times in the past, who has done wonderful work on assessing and increasing the conservation value of the collections that a garden is growing. So the thing is, the Huntington is not just a place which has an important collection of plants and those talents and expertise of people. It is a key centre in the BGCI family attempting to have this global impact that I'm going to be showing you. And then in London, this photo is a few years out of date. Because of COVID, we haven't been able to get together very often. So it's out of date. But this is the board and staff meeting on a strategy day in those happy pre-pandemic days. But we now have 40 staff, a wonderful board, which is very international, and we will be getting together in May to think about our strategy. But the point I want to make is 40 people can't change the world, but 60,000 experts from the Botanic Garden community can, and it's through that convening power that we can make a difference, and we can make it on a big scale. And Nicole's touched on the fact that we compile and analyse and draw together this information pooled from the botanic gardens of the world, but making it available so that there is the factual basis for conservation. And we're also involved in developing various international strategies and standards, and some of these have been really important. For example, there has been a global strategy for plant conservation which got adopted by the United Nations, and BGCI essentially made that happen and has championed it and seen it through. But I'll show you, my final example is the most amazing thing we've ever attempted to take on, which is to try to shift some things of profound importance in the global financial world. I'll come back to that. So one way we work is through consortia. This is just such an obvious thing to do, but we're doing it now. You get a group of people who have an interest in a group of plants, and you say, why don't you all get together and look after conserving and protecting those plants? So what BGCI does is convene and coordinate these global conservation consortia. And this is out of date now. There are more of them. So enthusiasts in different plant groups spring up and say, let's look after those plants. Not necessarily botanic garden people. And this is open to anyone who can join in and participate. And I'm going to show you an example from this, the Global Consortium for Dipterocarp Trees, which is based at Sichuan Tropical Botanic Garden in China. And if you haven't seen Dipterocarp trees in the wild, they are the most glorious things. They are forest giants. My close encounter that I'm having here was with a Dipterocarp forest in Sichuan, which happens to have the world's highest canopy walkway in the world, and I really wanted to get up there, but you have to know I'm terrified of heights. So when I let go fleetingly for a fraction of a second for a photograph to be taken and tried to look casual, I was actually terrified, but to have been up there and seen them close up, it was really important. Now the thing is with these Dipterocarp trees, they're the dominant trees in many of Southeast Asia's lowland tropical rainforests. So things like orangutans live there. They don't live somewhere else. But earlier this year, through that consortium process, this red list of Dipterocarpaceae, the family they belong to, was published. And this is the first expert assessment of the status of those trees in the wild, using this red listing standard, which is the approach that's used in the world. So we now know that out of 535 species of Dipterocarps, 67% of them are threatened. 29% are safe at the moment, and there's some we haven't yet been able to assess. But interestingly, out of that diversity, there's more than 200 species that only grow in a single country. And that's significant because countries are the level at which the United Nations approaches conservation of biodiversity through its conventions. And the country has an obligation and a responsibility for its biodiversity. So we need to be able to tell people what's where. And also, only 40% are in any kind of ex situ collection, forestry plantation, a botanic garden, or whatever it is. So most of them are out there in the wild, suffering hugely from extinction because of logging in these lowland forests. So now this consortium is wanting to protect and save these trees, but these are things nobody's really tried to grow before. There's a handful of people that know how to grow Dipterocarp trees properly. So what BGCI has been doing is to run training courses to share the expertise out of the heads of these botanic garden horticulturalists who know how to do that, something no one else knows. So these are just some slides from a PowerPoint that's presented on the web, and I just picked them at random. These are the fantastic wind-distributed seeds of Dipterocarps. The technology used in this is really simple, but what it's doing is sharing precisely how to lay out, how to do. Let seedlings grow under less and less shade until they can stand full exposure. This is stuff that isn't in the literature, it is in the heads of people who know how to do it. So sharing that is hugely important. So I'm going to come on to another example now. That was about these global consortia, but another thing that BGCI has done is coordinating a ecological restoration alliance of botanic gardens. And I'll introduce it with a family photo I took in about 1965 of my mum and dad and two of my brothers in the background on the highest mountain in Hong Kong, a place called Tai Mo Shan, those of you that might know Hong Kong. And in those days, this mountain was covered with grass that would burn every year with fires coming up from the farms down below. This landscape had looked like that for centuries. It's not recent environmental change, it's old environmental change. And what that's on the slopes over there is, I hope you can see, is ancient tea terraces. And they stopped growing tea on Tai Mo Shan about 1,000 years ago because the soil was exhausted. So it's not a great place to start thinking about growing things. And I knew it intimately when I was there as a kid. So when I started to go back and find out what Kadori Farm and Botanic Garden is doing with all those plants from the nursery, it's just astonishing. So this is a view from slightly lower down than where Mum and Dad were sitting, but in the background there, that wonderful domed hill is part of this farm and botanic garden, which was established during the Cultural Revolution in China by people who wanted to teach people fleeing from China how to farm and grow food for their families. And when that was no longer an issue in more recent times, they've really developed strongly their botanic garden side and a whole host of other things too. It's a wonderful institution. That is a firebreak of acacias planted on the farm, but this is the start of this restoration work. And in the foreground you can see these plastic tubes, which are tree tubes of hundreds of species of native trees to Hong Kong that were being planted there from that nursery. There's a slightly older photograph, but of what that looked like in about 2015. And it's done using experimental restoration plots. So the reason the tree tubes are different, of different designs, was everything was being evaluated. There are hundreds of different species of plants. Some had fertilizer, some didn't. They had different fertilizers. Some had these things around to shade out the grass, which competes very strongly with young trees. They wanted to know, how can we get a forest to grow quickly? And the answer is, bring in your horticulture experts and let's see. There's those tea terraces over there. So a botanic garden could do this. Anyway, I haven't been since 2019, so I asked Stefan Gale, who's now the head of conservation there, what's it look like now, Stefan? He sent me this picture which he took in March of that same view, and you can recognize that mountain at the top. That's a Botanic garden path that goes up to the summit of it. But this is now a young forest with, I forget, 300 species perhaps of tree in it, and hundreds more species of orchids and ferns, and it is a rich forest. Now, this place historically would have been subtropical rainforest. I mean, that's what was there before those bare hills. That hasn't been subtropical rainforest for more than 3,000 years. And if you'd asked me some years ago, would it ever be possible to have subtropical forest back in South China, I would have said, no, I don't think so. But look, they're doing it. Animals are coming back in now. There are porcupines, civet cats, all sorts of snakes, birds, insects in there. The biodiversity can come back now because there is a forest. It's just extraordinary what it has done. And I want to mention two things about this. One is that was expensive. Don't imagine you can do that without a lot of resources. That garden is well funded. They had a lot of money put into this, but they were determined to try and do it. The second thing is, just to say, that would never have happened how long you waited without Botanic garden intervention. And we very often hear that nature will take care of itself. 1,000 years, well, actually, it had a couple of thousand. It didn't work, did it? Nature cannot recover on its own. What happened when farming ended in Hong Kong, which by and large it has, is a very few species of trees did begin to reappear because they were ones in the soil seed bank. But the majority of trees in there were down to just a handful of surviving individuals in sacred woodlands in Hong Kong that could be used as a source of seed, bought into the nursery, bulked up, and planted onto the mountain. So it isn't correct that that could have happened if we'd stood back and left nature alone. It never would have done. And I just tried to indicate its importance for climate change, for biodiversity. And bear in mind, Hong Kong is one of the most densely populated cities on Earth. So this is in one of the most densely populated cities. So I want to say a little bit about the databases, which have been mentioned by Nicole. The key things I want to tell you is they're not databases that clever people at BDCI dreamt up. They're the contribution of information from botanic gardens around the world. But they are the largest and most complete authoritative sources of information. For example, on 3,765 botanic gardens, what plants they hold in their collections, and a new one for sharing material between botanic gardens. I'm going to focus on this one, which is Threat Search. And this is the most complete source of information on planet Earth on the status of individual plant species, how they're doing. We also have a global tree search, which is this country-level database, which we have created because we can then remind countries that you're the only place where this tree grows. It's yours to look after it for the future. Don't leave it to anyone else. So now I'm going to show you an example from Malawi, where Nicole mentioned I lived and worked there, taught at university, and I pressed the wrong thing. And when I was in Malawi in the late 70s, the national tree is this wonderful Malanje cedar, and I couldn't quite believe when I was told that this tree is nearly extinct on the one mountain that it grows on in the world. It was assessed by a wonderful friend, a man called Tembo Chanyenga, and some of the BGCI colleagues did this assessment, and there are only about 3 or 4 trees that produce seed up there. And a lot of people thought that's the end for this tree, which is a beautiful timber resistant to termites, incredibly valuable. But luckily, the Forestry Department of Malawi, which Tembo was the head of, had some years ago, probably 80 years ago, set up plantations to try and grow the tree on other mountains. And those have been well protected. So when I was there in 2018 to visit this project, my friend Tembo showed up with some more of these big bags of seeds he'd got. And the thing is, important to understand, the world has this shortage of seeds. Where do you get wild plants from? And so seed nurseries are of profound importance. Anyway, look at them, how happy with that bag of seed. And then we went to see what they were doing with it. And these women and men from the villages around Malanje Mountain were singing and dancing and welcoming us to visit the site. It was really moving. And this is why. What they were celebrating was, these are some of the thousands of young melange cedars that the villagers have grown. And they couldn't do it without experts from Bedgebury Pinetum in England showing them how to grow trees, and BGCI staff, because they'd never attempted to grow this tree. Now, here's a key thing. This had about £1 million worth in total of funding from the UK aid programme called the Darwin Initiative. In other words, again, it wasn't cheap to do this. But what it did was those villagers are smiling because they got paid for each tree they could grow, and then they got paid again for each one that could be put back onto the mountain. And now they're being paid for the survival and protection of those trees. Over 450,000 have been put back into the wild. It won't be a forest for a very long time, but that, together with the other trees that are up there, will restore that forest. Now, this is a kind of impact around the world that botanic gardens can have, and those lovely people in that village could not have done that without that sharing of expertise. I put up just a few of the Millennium Development Goals this hits, and I want to just tell you that one of the women who's in the photo there said to me, and it was very nice being in Malawi and people knew I'd lived there, so she was said that this project, what this has done for my family is I've been able to replace the thatched roof on my house that she and her husband had built with corrugated iron, so we're dry at night now, and we've got energy for lights. And most importantly, she told me, and my children can both stay in school past the age of 14, which is the end of free education in Malawi. And that's what they did with the money they got paid for those trees. And you have to make that flow of money happen. It's changed the lives of these people, and, well, it was just heartening to see it. It really, truly was. Just want to mention, these are a whole load of logos of some of the world's most famous botanic gardens. Those are the ones, some of the ones, in this ecological restoration of Alliance of Botanic Gardens. And all of these places are now joining in this endeavour to try to do that type of thing that's happening in Hong Kong, happening in Malawi, of working far from home to try to restore forests, and also close to home too. They don't all work together on any individual projects, but they work in that way. So this is a movement, this is a trend that's happening in our world of botanic gardens. I'm going to try and talk about the genetic level now, and this is a project at Benmore Botanic Garden, part of the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, and it is monkey puzzle trees from Chile, of which there are thousands in this landscape that's been planted there. But what I want to tell you about them is they are genetically samples down to the level of we know what each tree was, where it came from, collected by our staff together with their Chilean colleagues. And we know that there is every part of genetic diversity present in the wild is represented on this single hillside. So here is one of those seed orchards that can be used to restore diversity in Chile whenever it's called upon. And plus, this is replicated in Chile and on private and public gardens across England. So botanic gardens can purposefully go and make sure they're sampling the genetic diversity. And here's a lovely study done by BGCI US a few years ago, published in 2019, I think it was, which looks at an emerging concept in botanic gardens of the meta collection, which is not just one garden's collection. And a diagram I've lifted out from it just shows, even if we add just together two gardens' collections, look, they're more. Then if we make systematic efforts to add to that in terms of genetic diversity, we can do that. We can have this rich collection. What if you added in 100 gardens? So our target now, and understanding how the number of plants and the number of population sampled is capturing that genetic diversity. And that is hugely important because that is that future resilience I talked about. Now, I want to just touch briefly on the Bond Challenge. So, you may know that there was this commitment to bring 150 million hectares into restoration, and a big proportion of that's actually been pledged already, which is wonderful, superficially. And then in 2020, we started a UN Decade of Restoration, and the World Economic Forum set up an organization called 1 Trillion Trees, 1t.org. Now, this is, of course, marvelous and good news for the planet, but unfortunately, the way much of this is being done is completely wrong and often harmful. The Bonn Challenge, for example, in fact, half of the land that's being pledged, even if nothing has happened yet, is being planted with monoculture, single species plantations, not forests, and often of exotic trees which do not contribute to biodiversity and may even damage it. So at BGCI we wanted to do something about this. Here's a Hong Kong project. This is not part of the Bond Challenge, but it's an example of what the problems might be. I took this in 2014, 14 years after a wonderfully well-intentioned effort had been done by companies to create this corporate afforestation project. And they used 3 or 4 species of essentially of Australian hardy trees that were bought in and planted. And when I went 14 years later, these things are ferns and local shrubs, and there are 1 or 2 things which might have been trees, and there's some dead ones. But basically, everything died. They were not the right things to be planted there. And this is happening around the world, an attempt to plant trees, which is just what we need, but not knowing how to do it. So, in the Glasgow Climate Conference in 2016, Paul Smith, our chief executive, announced a global biodiversity standard we've launched. Now, the idea here is to try to influence the carbon market that is emerging around the world by being able to certify what's going on in these tree planting projects. And note that we didn't call it plant diversity. We are going for the bigger picture, biodiversity. So we will be able to evaluate a site to see how's the forest, but how's everything that lives in it. It's not always a forest. That I don't mean that it is. So it's a hugely ambitious thing we're trying to do, and it's centered around a paper that was published on the 10 golden rules for tree planting, an attempt to respond to what's going wrong. Now, you can't read that, of course, so here's my simplified version of what are the 10 golden rules. And you'll see there are things like protect existing forest first. Every one of these are the sorts of things I've been touching on that are the way botanic gardens go about their work. So we are trying to impose our culture onto the way that tree planting is being done in these big schemes. And there was a recent workshop in Kenya, this is now underway, with significant funding from the British government, some sponsorship from Etihad Airways and other organisations. And then right here, 1T.org said, we need to be a part of this. We want to be tested and evaluated. We want to change to make certain we're doing the right thing. Some of you may recognise other partners there. But at the next Conference of the Parties on Climate Change, it's going to be launched and to go live. And we know through board members who are in the world of, in the financial world and the world of carbon trading, that companies are crying out for this because they're embarrassed to discover that they've been doing exactly the wrong thing in too many cases. So those are some examples to show you what Botanic Gardens are doing. I'm just going to try and draw some conclusions out of this now. We know what to do, that's the point. Not in an arrogant way, but in a practical way we do. But it needs huge commitment, and it needs a massive amount of political leadership, which by and large we don't have at the moment anyway. But profoundly important, it won't be cheap. It can be done, but it's not going to be cheap. The skills and know-how exist. But I also want to make the point that despite it being expensive, it's way cheaper than the money we're already spending trying to deal with the already appalling impacts of climate change. And so the best and the most effective time is right now, or 10 years ago would be better. But it is expensive, but we must do that. Here's a second one I want to show, and this is inside that forest on Taimo Shan that KFBG have planted. And Gunter Fischer, who's now at Missouri Botanical Garden, led that project. He's standing under a tree he planted 4 years before, and contrast with those 14-year-old trees. But it's covered in orchids and ferns, and this ground story is rich in plants which were almost extinct, incredibly rare to find the ground flora. They've rebuilt this complex tropical forest. And our hope is that this new global biodiversity standard will spread this kind of best practice far beyond botanic gardens. So these demonstrate we can do it. And really, I think, right now, for botanic gardens, the challenge is for us together to collect and grow as much as we possibly can of the Earth's plant diversity so that we can carry it forward into the future. And we need to do that so that future generations can enjoy those ecosystem services and the quality of life that we can enjoy today. It's desperately important, and we know how to do it, but we need to get on with it. And it can only be done through international thinking and action. I think that's a little bit evident. So we're not yet making the effort we need to on planet Earth to secure our future. But again, we know how to do it. And the Botanic Garden is actually now stepping up to sharing tools, knowledge, the kind of things I've shown you, to actually make this possible and to do it. And I think the key is to recognizing that caring for the future of the planet is in our hands. We are the gardeners of that global garden. It can't be done any other way, and it won't be done without us. And we can play many roles. And one of the things I mean by that is, whoever you are sitting in the audience here today, you're part of supporting this effort. You love and engage with this garden. So please continue to do that, because in whatever capacity, as Botanic Garden professionals, as donors, as volunteers, whatever it may be, you are part of this incredible global movement, which is in the early stage and is taking off. So please do that. And, isn't it obvious? But the future that we want to have for the planet comes out of the knowledge, the expertise that rests in Botanic Gardens. We have it. We know what to do. Anyway, so thank you very much. And I'll be delighted to take any questions that you may have.
Okay. If you would wait for the mic. Here you are.
Thank you very much. I have a huge question. I'm with Friends of Griffith Park, and we constantly find ourselves at odds with working with the city. So how do you get the city on board?
Well, relentlessly till you've ground them down. The next of our international congresses is going to be held in Singapore, which, out of the cities I've visited on our planet, is the one that really has taken this to heart. It's incredible what they've done there in terms of planting back native trees into their parks and looking after their nature. And it is really tough. In the UK at the moment, 2 cities in particular have just felled all of their street trees, Sheffield and Plymouth. And the local governments for those cities did it because, well, they're worried about trees. Trees are dangerous. They can kill you. And the entire council, I'm sorry, I just said Plymouth, and I can't remember if it's Plymouth or Portsmouth. The local population have dismissed its town council. They are out. They did it in the night, chainsaws at night to fell trees. The local population are up in arms. 2 cities have done that now. I don't think a 3rd city will do that in the UK. The point about it is, and it's evident from your question, people care about that. No one's going to accept that being done in their city anymore. And we're at this point in time where we're still battling against idiotic mindsets which are thinking in the wrong way. There is no reason why a city should not be full of fabulous plant diversity. And indeed, there are cities around the world now that are really starting to see that and to do it. We have to keep shouting about these things. But that is a role again for the education side of institutions like this, just to make that point. I mean, I'm sure everybody in the room knows that if you have trees in a city, you're going to bring down the temperature. The health of the residents will go up. I saw a fabulous paper about life expectancy, a study done in Japan, where people who live on streets where there are trees live longer than people who live on streets where there are not. And that was a scientifically done proper research on an experimental basis. We know why it matters. So why do we sometimes elect these people? I don't know. Anyway. But don't stop is the point, isn't it? To make these changes takes time, and we have to keep going. But while that microphone is moving, one of the things I think is really important, and I couldn't touch on it much in that talk, is that actually this is important everywhere. This is not something that's important for nature reserves and far away. It is on our street and in every neighborhood that we need to be thinking about where's the plant life, which might be food, it might be an urban farm, it might be whatever it is. But we need to put that back in the center of life. Sorry, did the microphone arrive somewhere?
Beautiful presentation, first of all.
Thank you.
I've been reading about soil restoration. I'm curious, how does that fit into the process?
That's a great question. I'm sorry, I'm looking probably in the wrong direction because I can't see where the microphone... Oh, thank you. Well, it's hugely important, so thank you for asking me that, because going back to that example in Hong Kong, it's profoundly important. There was almost no soil. That's eroded granite on those mountainsides, no growing material. So what they had to work on was, when they put their plants into the ground, a huge amount of soil preparation. That's what they were doing in their experimental plots. And in that particular setup, one of the things they did was they used biochar, which is this amazing carbonized material. And they bought one of the world's biggest biochar machines you can buy. They got it from Australia. And they convert all sorts of leftover timber from their garden. It had orchards planted in the 60s, which the trees are dying and no longer bear fruit. So they've all been converted into this biochar, which locks up carbon, goes into the soil, has an amazing effect on improving soil quality. So that was one of the things they did. But the soil underneath those trees now has had massive attention, huge amount of mulching going on, and they would not have been able to get that forest to grow in the way it has without attending to soil. I mean, basically, when those horticultural people are in there doing this miracle of growing trees that have never been grown before, or plants that have never been grown, they start with, what growing medium is needed here? And this is the other crazy thing about some of those big tree planting schemes. Again, in the UK, so well-intentioned, school children being given a small oak seedling and sent into a field, and they dig that deeply into the ground, put the seedling in and walk away. And we see this on television all the time. Well done, school children just planted 100,000 oak trees. Well, if you go back next year, those things will not have grown from that to that even. They're fighting against the grass, the soil isn't right. It needs the effort to prepare the ground. You can't just put trees in and say, that's a tree. And one of the tragedies of these big tree planting schemes is that they're actually being used to justify continuing deforestation, because I may have chopped down these trees and converted it into paper or whatever, but look, for each one I felled, I planted 3 more. But something that tall is no substitute for this forest tree you took down. But unless you get it right with soil, you can't do it. And also, of course, when you do it, you start to have real soil, because soil is an interaction between plants and fungi and the mineral substrate of the earth. So the botanic garden horticulturist knows what medium they're going to have to put this plant in, or they'll work it out. We know all of that sort of stuff. That's my point, that things that are everyday and mundane in our community are the experience that has to be shared globally. In Malawi, those lovely villages, they had said, you can't grow the Melange cedar. It's never been grown. Nobody's ever grown it. Why not? Well, no one tried, actually, was one reason. But the other reason is, actually, and this is true that I was told as well that, well, the thing is, this is our special tree. God created it. We shouldn't try to replace God's work. Anyway, fortunately, the foresters had shown that it's easy to grow if you've got the seed and you can do it. And the villagers then sort of said, well, we think we're now doing God's work growing it. I don't know the right or wrong of that, but I do know that they had to be shown how to do it. They just had to be helped how to do it. But now, who are the experts in growing the Melange cedar? It's not the people from Bedgebury, Prinetum, or other botanic garden staff. It's those villagers around the mountain. They can tell you how to do it. And those are the people we need to be mobilizing to scale up, is people in their village, people in their community.
Two questions, if I may. Could you clarify again how these projects are being funded? The one in Malagua? And secondly, you mentioned the botanical garden in Hong Kong, which, as we know, is now being governed by mainland China. Do you see, or is there evidence of changing politics in an area affecting ongoing efforts to create these botanical gardens in
those
projects?
They're both great questions. I didn't really talk about the funding. I mentioned some big numbers because I want to emphasize that this work is not cheap. But actually the source of funding is incredibly broad. So there's a membership income to BGCI. Gardens join at different levels, and that is one income stream. And then we secure funding from a wide range of sources. At the moment, we're hoping for a big project from the aid organization in Germany, which is interested in funding forests in Africa done the right way. And we're confident, actually, we're likely to get that. But I mentioned specifically a UK government funding stream, which is called the Darwin Initiative, which is a biodiversity initiative. And it puts funding into projects, and the 3 projects successively on the Melange Cedar put in about £300,000. And so they're not enormous, but they're big amounts of money. But it's incredibly mixed sources of funding. I mean, basically, we'll take it wherever we can find it, and the benefit of having all those lovely Botanic Garden members is that very often that's something they might bring to the table. They've got some funding to do something. As it happens with Kadoorie Farm and Botanic Garden in Hong Kong, it is run by, and some of you will know Hong Kong, but the Kadoorie brothers who founded it were 2 of the wealthiest businessmen in Hong Kong. It's still managed through the family of those gentlemen. And they were the utility companies, I think, mainly in Hong Kong. So it wasn't cheap to do it. In terms of the politics in Hong Kong, I've not been back so much, but of course there have been enormous changes in the freedom of speech and behavior of individuals living in Hong Kong. And I've been very lucky in recent years to get to know a lot of young Hong Kong biology students studying at the different universities in Hong Kong. And I know how much they worry about their future at the moment. It's really a tough situation. But actually, there is strong support and recognition for what's being done there. So that institute is very popular in Hong Kong. And again, I always love to try and find, so what's the good news? This is the good news. Across the border in Shenzhen, just over the border from Hong Kong, where there were paddy fields when I lived in Hong Kong, there is now one of the world's major cities for electronics. And Shenzhen has a fantastic botanic garden. And nearby in Guangzhou is the most important botanic garden now in China in terms of receiving state funding. And I'm privileged to be an advisor to that South China Botanic Garden, which has just been given a new national status and funding from central government in China. The first thing I said to them is, you know what you could do? You and Shenzhen and Kadoorie Farm, you could work together to restore the subtropical forest of South China across multiple sites in mainland China as well as on the Hong Kong side of the border. And I know my Botanic Garden friends will try their utmost to do that, and I believe they'll succeed in the end. And I think we Botanic Garden people, especially working in countries around the world, have to be immensely pragmatic about how we can make anything work on the ground. But when we do amazing things like we have been able to do in places, normally it's welcomed. We work in some challenging and difficult places.
Hi, good evening. I want to know what your vision is for balancing the need to feed an ever-increasing population and maintaining a more biodiverse planet when monoagriculture has become such a terrible issue in a climate change arena.
Well, what a lovely audience you are, because these are all the perfect questions that allow me to talk about things I couldn't conceivably fit in. I mean, this is the point about plants sustaining life on Earth. We don't just need to have beautiful, diverse subtropical forests, we also need to eat. And that balance is hugely important. But I think in both cases there's a contribution that can come from botanic gardens. And very, very slowly around the world, one of the things we see people learning, which we knew centuries ago probably, but now we're learning it, is that there are many ways of doing farming. And especially in tropical countries, you know, for example, I think of Malawi, where it's a great tea growing country. So when tea was planted at first, it was always under shade trees. Then somebody had the bright idea that if we cut down the shade trees, maybe we'll get more tea. So they did that. Actually, they don't. So now they've put the shade trees back. But when the shade trees went, of course, the birds went. And there are many places now going towards this so-called agro-farming type of systems where you make sure you've got the trees as well as the crop you're trying to grow. And some of these are beginning to demonstrate such incredibly successful ways of growing things that are cleverer than how we used to do it in the past. And we do know that massive, great fields with incredibly intense input of chemical fertilizers and so on is not the right way to do things. As a child, I'm sorry, for me everything's a story about what you saw in your life. When I was a little boy living in England, my parents would go for picnics to a place it's called Dovedale. It's a beautiful scenic area. And the River Dove had little bridges going over. And I would stand on that bridge. I took my own children to see it years later. When I stood on it as a child in the 1950s, that river underneath me was full of trout swimming in their thousands. I couldn't show my children what a trout looks like because there aren't any now. Currently in Britain, most of our rivers are dead and sterile. There are some exceptions, fortunately. There's starting to be a huge public outcry about that, and rightly, it's long overdue. There are sewage discharges every day by these companies who have obligations and responsibilities not to do that. And I think that finally government pressure will come to bear on them, because that has to be done properly. But also another major trend in farming or in food production is the bringing it into cities. And I've seen some lovely examples of vertical gardens and people doing community projects within cities that are just inspiring. So we need to take a fresh look at all of these things and really learn from what we know that's best about how to feed the future. Do you know, here's an interesting thing that relates to that is, I don't know what it's like in the States, but in the UK at the moment, there's been this huge trend, especially with younger people, towards a plant-based diet. Well, that is just fabulous. That moves human beings a whole rung down the food chain, and is massively an important thing to do. Well, it means that if you go into any supermarket even now in the UK and you look at the food that they've got, the biggest signs say plant-based, come up, these are the plant-based things. You go into McDonald's or somewhere like that, they've got their plant-based burgers as well. They've got it because people want that. They want to be eating that. People know now these changes in behavior matter. And I just find it wonderful that when I was young, if you wanted to eat vegetarian food, which for many years is all I ate, now I eat practically anything, but I was a strict vegetarian for 10 years. I had to make everything from raw ingredients. There was nothing. I couldn't have gone to McDonald's and said, I'll have the plant-based burger. But, the what? But there are major trends going on in how we eat, how we interact, especially in younger generations of people who have that understanding that, basically they'd like to have a decent future, is what it comes down to. I don't know, is that happening here as well, that plant-based diet? Yeah, good.
So we have time for one more question. Oh boy, okay, right in front.
You can ask me afterwards. Oh, there it comes.
I guess my question is because we're, LA County residents, there's like this, this growing trend of converting our lawns to our native plants, which is like mainly like succulents and desert plants and things like that, to like conserve water. But what are kind of like, clearly with our beautiful Huntington garden here, our soil is capable of growing so many different plant species. So what is your idea of like converting back into like native plants and like what is more beneficial for our environment?
That's another extremely big question, and there's so many strands to it. And so I'll give you one answer about a trend that's happening in the UK at the moment, is where in our family gardens at home in the UK, people's pride and joy is how the quality of their lawn. And there's been this trend in the past couple of years, very strongly promoted by the Royal Horticultural Society, to let wildlife grow. And people are reporting incredible things coming up in their garden simply because they didn't cut the grass every week. And plus they found out, it's much nicer not to have to do that. So one movement we have is towards not mowing your lawn and seeing, wild orchids come up and incredible things like this, and you can get your garden in the newspaper. So it's interesting how that's changing. The idea of a lawn as the most beautiful thing, the centerpiece of any garden is just, I think, is going in a fashion sense. But of course, there's nothing wrong with having some lawn. But the key question is often going to be, so how are you watering it? So if you're in a place where there is abundant water, that might be no problem. But when it's being done by, if let's say pumping waters out of aquifers that are becoming depleted, then, that's pretty worrying. So again, another trend that's becoming more and more popular in the UK is people making sure they collect runoff rainwater off their roofs and use that to water their garden. That's not exactly a major breakthrough in inventive thinking, is it? But I just think there's an increased awareness that we need to think, how are we doing it? And I know as I've been walking around the Huntington with Nicole in the past couple of days, you must have pointed out at least 3 examples of places where, and now I know you have reservoirs too, which is pretty essential, I would think, but where we're going to be harvesting the water and showing how to do. So a botanic garden can be this, to abuse Shakespeare again, it's a stage, it's a platform for showing how to do those things. And increasingly, I think, botanic gardens are setting up demonstrations, I know in the UK, less familiar in the States, of how to grow plants that are less water demanding, let's say, and how to do these things so differently. And that catches on very fast. People quickly learn that rather than my neighbour has a beautiful lawn, to see that my neighbour has fantastic wildflowers in their grass. Or better still, my neighbour has planted some sort of interesting mixture of things which isn't a lawn at all anymore. Or my neighbour's just bought one of these wonderful water tanks that fits on their drain pipe. And look at them, they're not turning on a tap and watering their garden like that, or having a sprinkler going all day. They water intelligently at certain times of day with their watering can. I mean, I don't know. That wonderful expression, it's not rocket science, applies to so many things. But what I think is heartening, and I really like, is that people are even talking about these things and caring about them, and that there are trends and movements. But I think there are never any absolutes that are always going to be universally correct in any one place. The context is hugely, hugely important. And that in itself gives a diversity of landscape. Royal Horticultural Society added up the gardens of the UK and calculated their area, which is bigger than our national parks. And they've been encouraging everyone, however tiny your garden is, you're part of this bigger than the national parks thing, which is our gardens. It's making, that's again, it's this gardening the earth, I like to think of it as. It's that way of thinking about, here's this little patch of land that might be mine. Or a wall which I've got some pots on. What am I going to grow? How am I going to use it? And that balance between food and between supporting nature is critical, of course.
Thank you very much. And you'll be here outside if people have burning questions, right?
Well, I'm always, shutting me up is usually the problem. But